Welcome back, everybody. So we are going through a series on building a forged BP Miata engine, and the next step is to select all of the components for your build. I'm a firm believer in having a full and complete game plan before you start, which means defining what you want the engine to be when you're done. In terms of power level, driving style. Are you using it for racing? Is it just a street toy? If you don't have that mapped out, it's going to be confusing when you go to start collecting parts. You may wind up with a motor that's kind of a hodgepodge. So fully define what your desires are for your engine, and that'll give you a guideline when you go to select parts. And then the second thing that I do, once I've got that sorted out, is budget out all of the parts I need to complete the build. There's no sense starting something if you can't finish it financially, or if there's lead time constraints or whatnot. So planning is a necessity. I do my planning on an Excel sheet in the computer. I map out all of the parts with the lead times on getting some stuff, and just to make sure I know when the final motor is going to be ready to drop in. Now, if you are rebuilding your motor for stock power levels, you're just freshening it up, most of the parts on the motor you can reuse. If I was redoing it, an OEM rebuild, I would reuse the oil pump, take it apart, clean it up, and then put that back on. I would reuse the rods, and if I didn't have to bore it out, I'd probably reuse the pistons. If we're doing a forged motor, the only pieces that we do not replace is the block, crankshaft, and cylinder head. Everything else is we put aftermarket stuff in. These motors are remarkably durable, and it's a really decent design. I don't know of many 20-year-old cars that you can go randomly grab 50 of them, stick them on a racetrack, and run them at redline all day, and they're all still running at the end of the day. It's a phenomenally understressed engine, but when you start adding boost or RPM, you got to account for the added stresses that you're putting on the system, and you got to beef it up. So the other thing that I will say is that there's tons of parts out there for these engines, and everybody's got an opinion on which ones are good and which ones are bad. I'm not going to tell you that these parts are the correct ones. I've tried most of the more common combinations of parts, and I have my own opinions on what I like. There's no wrong answer. You're going to find all sorts of different opinions. So at the end of the day, you just got to pick something and go for it. Do all the homework you can do, and then just commit to something. And if something happens and you pick the wrong parts, it was a learning experience. That's the only way to learn. So we'll start in the middle of the motor and work our way out. So we'll start with the pistons. There's two common pistons that you can get if you're doing a forged motor, and that would be the SuperTech pistons or a Wiseco, and there's a couple different versions of the Wiseco. I have a SuperTech here. I've used the SuperTechs. They're not bad. I'll say that I like the Wisecos better, and I'll get into that reasons, but I had these SuperTechs in a motor for about 10,000 miles, and they held up just fine, even though the motor had some issues and wound up detonating severely at a racetrack. And you can see well, maybe not on the camera, but these pistons took a severe beating, and they're scuffed up, and the cylinder walls took a beating, but they held up. So it is a decent piston. And for a race-only application, I would have no problem sticking these in a motor. The Wiseco pistons, which I'll put a picture up here, also have a skirt coating. And in addition to increasing longevity, it also helps a huge amount with the noise that a forged piston makes in a motor. So piston slap is a thing when you start building a forged motor. The forged pistons are made of a denser material. It takes a little bit longer to expand than the stock hypertectic pistons. Plus, since you're going to typically running a higher combustion chamber temperature, you have to increase the piston to wall clearance a little bit to make sure the piston doesn't expand and seize in the bore. All of this means that on a cold start, the piston will rock slightly in the chamber, and you will hear that. The coating on the Wisecos goes a long way to reducing that noise. On the 66 back here, I can't hear it at all. It's completely silent. When we had these pistons in the car, if it was a cold day, 40 degrees, and you started it up, you'd hear tick, 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 tick for a minute or two until the pistons came up to temperature, and then it was fine after that. So again, if it's a race car, doesn't matter. for a car that you drive around the street and you want to last a long time, my opinion, it's worth it to go for the Wiseco pistons. Now, there's different Wiseco pistons at different prices, and you may have noticed that some of them are drastically more expensive than some others. Some of them are coated with different things. I think some of them are ceramic coated to better, reflect the heat and survive higher combustion temperatures. If you're not building a motor that's in the 400 plus horsepower range, probably don't need that. It's not going to hurt anything if it's there, but it's not a need. So I buy the Wiseco pistons straight from Wiseco. You can find them in their catalog. They have a couple different compression ratios and diameters. Their price is not that much more than the SuperTech, and in my opinion, worth the little bit extra. It just, when you hold the piston in your hand, it's just a nicer product, and I've been very happy with them in this car so far. Next up would be rods, and this rod is my favorite. Again, is it the best rod you can buy? Probably not, but it's the best strength to dollar ratio. If you're building an 800 horsepower monster, probably need to go get something that's billet or better off. But for a normal street motor where you're in the 200 or 300 horsepower ballpark, the Manley H-beam rod I'm a big fan of. It comes with the ARP studs. You don't have to go remachine it. And I've had no issues so far with them. And reused the same rods out of the motor in this car a couple of times, and phenomenal. They come pre-balanced. The box that they come in even tells you the big end and the little end weight. And I double check that just to make sure it's correct, but that helps a ton when we go to balance the rotating assembly, having those measurements. So big fan of the Manley rods. In terms of the bearings, which is your next thing, the ACL race bearings is what I've landed on is bearing of choice for a performance motor. They come in a couple different sizes. If you had to undersize your crank a little bit, you can get undersized bearings to match that. Oil pump. There's only one aftermarket oil pump for the Miata on the market, and that's the Boundary Engineering billet pump. So why would you need that? Because stock Miatas are not known for blowing up due to oiling issues, so you'd think that the stock pump would be just fine. What can happen, and I've not seen this personally, but I've heard about it, is the crankshaft in the Miata can eventually, if you apply enough power or RPM, flex. And since the gears in the oil pump are driven off of the nose of the crank, they get run into each other, and the soft powder metal gears that come in the OEM pumps can shatter. So the Boundary pumps has machined aluminum gears in there that will hold up if they do run into each other. It's not going to remove the crank flexing issue, it just means that the gears won't explode if that scenario happens. If your crank is flexing a ton, there's other things you want to look at, but for $300 I think it is, it's a fairly cheap upgrade that gives you peace of mind that your oiling system is going to survive. And they've already done the math on how to shim the pressure relief valve in there to give you higher oil pressure, which is especially important if you're running a turbo and your oiling system is also supplying pressure for the turbo in addition to the motor. You don't want to starve it. So 2 thumbs up for the Boundary pump. If you're doing a high horsepower build and you're putting all this money into it, go ahead and do the ARP studs all the way around. If you're getting the rods, they've already got them in them, so you're just missing the mains and the head bolts. If you do the mains, which I do recommend, you do need to get the block line board, which is something you need to have ready before you go to the machine shop. Lots of places online where you can look into this, but if you put hardened studs in, it'll change the shape of the hole a tiny little bit. And you want to make sure that it's a perfect circle again. And the ARP, or the Boundary guys, I think will tell you this when you get their pump, but make sure that your machinist, when he line bores, does not move the center line of the crankshaft. So one method for line boring is to take each of the main caps, shave off a little bit off of the bottom, and then drill a new hole through it, which does make a perfectly round hole, but it moves the location of the crank relative to the block. And because you're driving the oil pump off of the nose of the crank, you don't want to change the location of that nose relative to the mounting holes in the front of the block. So make sure your machinist knows not to deck the main caps, but just to run a reamer down it and make them true again. Alright, water pump and timing kit. There's nothing special about this. I run the Gates water pumps, as I think most everyone does. Never had an issue with it. Cast versus sheet metal impeller. I don't personally have an opinion on those. I've seen both last for hundreds of thousands of miles. Some people swear by one or the other. Leave that up to you to decide. The gaskets, I am a Fel-Pro guy. I like the Fel-Pro gaskets. I've never had an issue with one. Again, personal opinion. I've seen the Mahle gaskets work. OEM gaskets are fine. You pay a little bit more for them. I like the Fel-Pro ones, just personal preference. Seen no issues with them so far. The head gasket on a stock Miata is already a multi-layer steel gasket, which is the correct one that you want for boost. So either another OEM gasket or a Fel-Pro or Mahle, so long as it's multi-layer steel, you're good to go on the gasket. And I do recommend when you're doing a rebuild, if you're doing all this work anyway, have the block and the head decked. It doesn't cost that much extra at your shop to go ahead if they've already got them in there anyway. The multi-layer steel gaskets do like a really flat, smooth surface to seal really good, so just have them take a thousandths off and make it dead flat again. Head work. Most of the time you don't need any additional pieces for the head apart from the seals. If you start getting into porting or enlarging the valves, then you need to look into what you need in terms of different valves and whatnot. But most of the time we're able to pull the valves out, lap them, and put them back in again. If there's a bent one or someone that's just too far gone, we'll replace it with another OEM valve. And then you replace the valve stem seals, of course, and put the head back together. On NA6s and NA8s, we take out the hydraulic lifters, take them all apart, clean them, and put them back together. There isn't really a way for a lifter to go bad. There's nothing in it that can go bad. They just get clogged up and they no longer flow oil. If you take them completely apart, you can clean them. You can put new ones in. I haven't seen any better results by doing that than simply cleaning them. On the NB motors, they have the solid shims, and they do fall out of adjustment. So every NB head we get in here, after lapping the valves and reassembling it, go back through and check all of the lifter clearances, and inevitably have to change every single one of them to get them exactly back to factory spec. If we're running a boosted motor, we might do a little bit looser tolerance on the exhaust valves just to make sure there's no issue. So it's like factory's 11 to 13, we'll err on the side of the 13. But otherwise, it's a factory rebuild. Oh, a couple other things you will need, and we'll get into this in detail as we build this motor we're working on now. When your block comes back from the machinist, there's some pieces that he probably will have or should have taken out of the block. If he didn't, you need to do them. There's two brass plugs for the oil galleys, and you want to pull those out because you want to clean all of those passages really, really well. There's also two alignment studs for the cylinder head that I'll have had to remove to deck the head once I got them out without damaging them. I'm sure there's a trick, I don't know, but they're cheap to get some new ones and pop in there, and just make sure that your head is square. So you'll need both of those pieces. I keep a bucket of them in stock because we go through them so regularly. Pull all the plugs out of the block. You do not have to pull out the freeze plugs. I'll check them. If they look like they're still seated and the blocks had never had any issues, I'll leave the freeze plugs in. If they're bad, you got to pop them out and replace them. But again, it's a cheap piece to get. Alright, so I think that covers everything. Again, there's lots of parts out there. It's a really popular motor to build, so there's tons of pieces that you can choose from. Do your homework, see what people like and don't like. This is my opinion on what parts I've landed on that I really like. And if you're doing something that's more of a high performance build, you're gonna have to be a little bit more careful. If it's a bit milder, lots of people run 200 plus horsepower on a bone stock motor without opening it up and don't have any issues. Other people run 200 horsepower on a bone stock motor and it blows up. So again, I prefer to do things correctly rather than the cheap way. If you're going to do something, do it right. If you're building a motor with us, we'll definitely help you through that and help you source the components. And help guide you in the direction if you're not sure what your build needs. So, all right, next time we should be able to start. We're waiting on parts to come in, then we're going to take our block to the machine shop. So next video we should be ready to start cleaning it and putting it back together. See you guys next time.